The man never expected to take care of two children just after being reincarnated, all because a god accidentally killed him. He was sent to a world managed by the god, who hoped he would help take care of the children. Although baffling, the protagonist agreed, because the god granted him extraordinary talents. Shortly after being reincarnated, the protagonist encountered a C-class red wolf. He used an air bullet skill and killed it instantly. After storing the red wolf in his spatial inventory, the protagonist noticed some movement behind him and saw a twin. He realized these might be the children the god mentioned, and since they were in a monster-filled forest, he couldn't just watch the two children die. When he tried to ask their names, the two children became somewhat frightened, but after hearing their stomachs growl, he remembered he had food in his inventory. He chose something at random and let them eat. Seeing how deliciously the protagonist ate, the children were tempted to try, and indeed, the food was delicious. The protagonist noticed that the children's clothes were tattered, so he decided to give them a set of clothes and used a cleaning spell to tidy them up. It was strange that no matter what the protagonist did or asked their names, the children remained silent. It seemed the children did not want to speak, or perhaps they couldn't. So, the protagonist decided to check their status bars. Seeing they had no names, he named them himself. The boy was called Alan, and the girl, Elena. Although the children still didn't speak, their willingness to follow him suggested they accepted him. Suddenly the children started running towards a monster. The protagonist instinctively wanted to use magic, but worried about involving the children. Such strong 5-year-olds. This instantly confirmed the protagonist's guess, that they were not ordinary children. This made him understand why the children survived in the forest. So, no matter what incredible scenes he saw next, the protagonist was no longer surprised. And when they finally reached a town, the gate guards were shocked to learn they came from Gaia Forest. The protagonist then realized that the forest was very dangerous and generally recommended only above Class A. The protagonist bluffed that he hadn't ventured deep, but had only gathered herbs on the outskirts, which made sense then. Hearing that the protagonist had no ID, the guard quickly took out a crystal ball, a magic tool used to investigate criminal history. It was confirmed there were none. The guard issued the protagonist 3 temporary IDs, but mentioned that if he wanted to stay long-term, he would need to register at the Adventurers Guild. However, the protagonist wasn't in a hurry, and instead first went to the town's church. The protagonist speaks with the wind god. The protagonist was puzzled to learn the children were the water gods. However, the wind god didn't want to explain the details, only wishing that he would personally take care of them. Fortunately, the protagonist had no intention of doing so. In just that short time, he had already grown fond of the two children. That evening the protagonist found a hotel. The children played on the bed like a trampoline. The protagonist did not stop them till they fell asleep. When he woke up, to his surprise, the children were up even earlier than him. Good morning, they spoke. This was the first time the protagonist heard their voices. Although he didn't know why, this was a big step forward for him. Next, he took the two children to the Adventurers Guild to register and prepare to get official IDs. The scene puzzled the receptionist, as it was her first time seeing children in the Adventurers Guild. However, since there was no age restriction, she quickly completed the protagonist's paperwork and introduced some of the guild rules. The adventurers' ranks range from F to S, with an additional SS rank above S, but no one has achieved it so far. As for the missions available, there are 3 types: herb gathering, escort missions, and monster subjugation. Hearing this, the protagonist decides to take on a mission to try. Since it was his first time and he was with 2 children, he chose the simplest task of gathering herbs. Soon, they were back in a forest where the danger level was very low, with only F-class monsters appearing. The slimes were just toys for the 2 children. It was then that the protagonist found their target herb, a lily herb. After teaching the children how to pick it, they quickly caught on and each collected a bunch. The protagonist didn't hesitate to praise them, originally just as encouragement for the kids, but unexpectedly, the 2 ended up gathering more than he did. When they returned, this shocked the receptionist. She had never seen anyone gather so much in half a day. Although still somewhat unbelievable, upon hearing that the protagonist had children helping him, the receptionist accepted it. Just as she was about to settle his account, a familiar scene unfolded. The bald man didn't think this was a place for children, but clearly, he had picked the wrong opponents. It wasn't the protagonist who disciplined him, but the 2 little ones. Stop, Alan, Elena. The protagonist wasn't afraid they would teach the bald man a lesson, but he was afraid they might accidentally kill someone. However, the children misunderstood his intentions and started crying, thinking they had done something wrong. Just as the protagonist was unsure what to do, the guard he had met the day before walked in. After learning what had happened, he also said that people like the bald man deserved a beating, but he couldn't help saying that the protagonist didn't know how to handle children, wondering if they were even his. This led the protagonist to no longer hide the truth. He explained that he had met the children in the Gaia Forest and didn't know if they were lost. Hearing this, the guard was very shocked, and the receptionist remembered the recent incident attack in the Gaia Forest. The children might have been abandoned. This made the guard suddenly see the protagonist in a new light. Despite his young age, he was raising 2 orphans. But just then, the receptionist got excited. Since the protagonist had been to the Gaia Forest, did he have any materials from the monsters there? Wanting to keep a low profile, the protagonist only mentioned the weakest, the red wolf, but the receptionist decisively bought it at a high price. Unexpectedly, this sale brought the protagonist a string of silver coins, which was sky-high compared to the price of herbs. At that moment, Red Hair asked the protagonist if he wanted to join an expedition, as they regularly went to the Gaia forest to reduce the number of monsters. With his capabilities, the protagonist should join them to earn quickly through monster materials rather than picking herbs. I'm only F rank. You went hunting red wolves in the Gaia forest alone, and you're scared of what? Oops, it seems even red wolves shouldn't have been mentioned. The man never expected that after being reincarnated, he would be given 3 divine pets by the water god. All 3, still in their juvenile phase, possessed the strength of a normal A-rank monster. Unfortunately, he didn't have time to study the divine pets, but had them hide themselves well, preparing for his first participation in a monster subjugation expedition. To reduce the number of monsters that could harm people, this was a task periodically undertaken by the Knight's Order, and only adventurers of A rank or above had the capacity to survive. The client was the captain of the Knight's Order. After witnessing the 2 children kick a C-rank adventurer, insisted on pulling the F-rank protagonist into this, but as a trade-off, he would receive more rewards than usual. Besides the Knight's Order, there was also a team composed of A-rank adventurers. Initially, they were apprehensive about the protagonist joining the mission, but after Red Hair assured that they would not cause trouble, but would be a strong asset, they had no choice but to accept. As expected, not long after entering the forest, the 2 children displayed their special abilities. They pointed unanimously in one direction, indicating that monsters would come from there. But when everyone looked, they couldn't find even a trace of a monster. Just in case, Rudolph had his teammates use magic to scout, but there was no reaction. There were no signs of monsters nearby. But how could the protagonist tell them? This was because the children could detect from a wide range. After an unknown amount of time, the scouting finally showed a reaction, and everyone immediately went on alert. When they saw the approaching C-rank red wolves, everyone prepared for battle, but unexpectedly, the 2 children suddenly rushed out. Shoot, I forgot to tell them to hold back today. As expected, the protagonist immediately saw everyone's stunned reactions. 2 such young children dragging the red wolf, but knowing he had miscalculated, he had no choice but to praise the children's performance stiffly. However, he quickly changed his tone, telling them not to act immediately, because the big brothers around also want to fight the monsters. Red Hair couldn't hold back, as there are limits to boasting. Red wolves are C-class monsters, and while the children had previously defeated a C-class adventurer, he thought it was due to the opponent's carelessness. Killing a monster, especially with such ease, was a different matter entirely. Not daring to tell the truth, the protagonist then said that he had encountered the 2 children in the Gaia forest. He remembered he had mentioned this before. Although he didn't know if they were lost, they had indeed spent a few days in that forest. This also meant that they were already strong when he met them. Of course, the protagonist wasn't lying. With this statement, the air suddenly grew quiet, and everyone no longer pursued the matter deeply. They quickly moved on, but the 2 children couldn't stay idle and soon strayed from the group, bringing back a spirit herb for the protagonist. It turned out to be a very precious magical herb, which the protagonist had told them about before, but he hadn't expected that they would actually remember it. As this drew too much attention, the protagonist told them not to run around randomly since it was a group activity. The 2 immediately asked, "Is it okay as long as we keep up with the group?" It seems so. Yay! Thus, after this, the protagonist could no longer control them. Soon, they discovered something called rock water moss and asked the protagonist to come and pick it. At this time, Red Hair also came to join in the fun, initially unsure what it was, but when his deputy told him it was a herb that could cure foot odor, which was very rare in the town. But then the deputy suddenly noticed something. Although they were still on the outskirts of the forest, they had encountered orcs, a type of monster that travels in packs. This reminder made Rudolph realize that the forest was much quieter than usual, which also meant that something unusual might have happened. As they became increasingly vigilant, suddenly a flare caught their attention. It turned out that there were several other teams traveling with them, and a red flare meant that they had encountered a situation that could lead to death. Seeing everyone's expressions turn very serious, the protagonist could no longer afford to hide his abilities, especially since his strength had already been exposed. He mentioned that he had a faster way to travel. "What exactly are you? Wind. Become the whirlwind around me. Accelerate. Wait a minute. That's fast." Soon, the protagonist also understood what had happened. Seeing that the monsters that appeared were an advanced type of red wolves, namely the B-rank blood wolves, and that there were injured people, the protagonist decided to act immediately. He hesitated no further and pulled out the special weapon given to him by the water god, enlisting the help of the 2 children. "Are you guys okay? Let's go. What's going on? These blood wolves couldn't have been defeated by you, could they?" Compared to before, Red Hair was undoubtedly more shocking this time because the protagonist did not look very strong, truly a well-kept secret. But perhaps it was said too forcefully, making the 2 children think that Red Hair was bullying the protagonist. Amidst laughter and cheers, they continued on their way. Just then, the protagonist realized that he was being watched, and the 2 children felt it it too, confirming that his sensation was not an illusion. He couldn't determine who it was, only that the person harbored malice towards him, clearly emitting an unpleasant aura.